The night my family died, I was 17 years old, hiding in the crawl space beneath our farmhouse in the dusty plains of West Texas. My hand clamped over my mouth to stifle the screams that clawed at my throat, my heart pounding so violently against my ribs that I was certain the men who had just murdered my father, my mother, and my 3 younger siblings would hear it and come for me too. But they did not, because they were too busy ransacking our home looking for the money my father had refused to give them, the money he had hidden away to pay for my college education, the money that had cost him his life. And I heard their boots stomping on the floorboards above me. I heard their guttural laughter as they smashed our furniture and ripped open our mattresses, I heard one of them say. The old man was too stupid to know when to cooperate, but we'll find the cash, we always find the cash. And then another voice, colder, more calculating, replied, "Burn the place down, make it look like an accident." Nobody will ask questions in this godforsaken town. And I felt a surge of terror so absolute that my vision went white because they were going to burn us. They were going to erase every trace of our existence. And I would die in that crawl space, suffocated by smoke and ash, and my family's deaths would be dismissed as a tragic accident, and the men who had slaughtered them would walk free, laughing about it over whiskey and cards. And I could not let that happen. I could not let them win, so I did the only thing I could think of. I scrambled out of the crawl space through a loose board at the back of the house. And I ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me through the fields of withered corn, through the barbed wire fence that tore at my skin through the darkness of the Texas night. With the sound of gunfire and flames behind me, and I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed in a ditch, bleeding and sobbing and cursing every god I had ever believed in. And when the sun rose, I looked back and saw that our farmhouse was nothing but a pile of smoldering ruins, and I knew that my family was gone, that I was alone, that everything I had ever loved had been taken from me in a single brutal night, and I made a vow there in that ditch with the ashes of my home still smoking on the horizon, that I would not rest, I would not stop, I would not give up until every single one of those men was dead. I would hunt them down one by one, and I would make them suffer the way my family had suffered, and I would do it with my own hands because the law would not help me. The police were corrupt and lazy, and my father had been a small-time farmer who owed money to the wrong people, and nobody cared about a dead immigrant family in the middle of nowhere. So I had to become the justice that the world had denied me. I had to become a weapon, a avenger, a ghost that would haunt the nightmares of every gangster in the state, and I started by surviving. Because survival was the first step toward revenge, and I walked for 2 days until I reached a small town where I stole clothes from a clothesline and food from a garbage can. And I made my way to the nearest city, a sprawling metropolis called Amarillo, where I knew the underground was thick and the desperate congregated like flies, and I found refuge in a shelter run by a kind priest, who asked no questions and fed me hot soup, and I stayed there for a month, healing my wounds and planning my future. Because I knew that I could not take on an entire gang of hardened criminals with nothing but my bare hands and my rage. I needed training. I needed skills. I needed to become something more than a frightened teenager. And so I sought out the one person in that city who could teach me what I needed to know, a man named Salvatore, a former mafia enforcer who had gone into hiding after betraying his own boss. And he ran a small gym in the basement of an abandoned warehouse, training fighters and wannabe gangsters for a price. And I went to him and I told him my story and I said, "Train me. Teach me everything you know how to fight, how to shoot, how to survive, and I will pay you back. I will give you my life if I have to." And Salvatore looked at me with his cold, calculating eyes, and he said, "You're a little girl. You're nothing but bones, and tears what makes you think you can survive the kind of life you're asking for." And I looked him in the eye, and I said, "Because I have nothing left to lose, because the men who killed my family are still breathing, and I will not stop until they are not." And something in my voice, something in my eyes must have convinced him because he nodded and he said, "Okay, girl, but I warn you, this path will change you. It will take everything you have and leave you hollow, and you will never be the same again. Are you sure you want that?" And I said, "I am already hollow. There is nothing left to take." And so began my apprenticeship, years of brutal training, of broken bones and bloodied knuckles, of sleepless nights and endless drills, of learning to use every weapon, every technique, every trick of the trade, and I immersed myself in the underworld. I learned how to track people, how to interrogate them, how to make them talk, how to disappear without a trace, and I also learned the identity of the men who had killed my family. They were members of the Hermanos del Norte, a ruthless drug cartel that operated across the Texas-Mexico border. And their leader was a man named Miguel Ortega, a psychopath who had risen through the ranks by killing anyone who stood in his way. And he had ordered my father's execution because my father had refused to let them use our farm as a smuggling route. And the men who had pulled the triggers were his lieutenants. 4 men with names I carved into my memory. Hector, the one who had laughed while my mother begged for mercy. Javier, the one who had shot my little brother in the back. Carlos, the one who had set the fire. And Rodrigo, the one who had stood in the doorway and watched it all, and I knew that I would have to go through all of them to get to Ortega. And I would have to be patient because patience was the key to survival. And I waited. I trained. I grew stronger, and when I was 22, 5 years after the night my family died, I was ready to begin. And I started with Hector because he was the most vulnerable, the one who had let his guard down after years of easy living. He had retired from the cartel and opened a bar in a small town near the border, thinking that his past was behind him. But the past never dies, it only waits. And I walked into his bar on a quiet Tuesday night, wearing a tight dress and a smile that did not reach my eyes, and I sat down next to him, and I ordered a drink. And he leered at me with his yellowed teeth and his whiskey-soaked breath, and he said, "What's a pretty little thing like you doing in a place like this?" And I leaned in close and I whispered, "I'm here to collect a debt." And before he could react, I drove a knife into his thigh, a deep, twisting cut that severed his femoral artery. And I watched the blood spurt out bright and arterial, and he screamed, but the music was loud and the bar was empty, and I covered his mouth with my hand and I said, "Do you remember a farmhouse in West Texas? Do you remember a family of 5? Do you remember the fire? Do you remember the woman who begged for her children's lives?" And his eyes widened with recognition, with terror, because he knew exactly who I was. And he tried to speak, but I had already slit his throat. And I watched him bleed out on the sticky floor of his own bar, and I felt nothing, absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction, not remorse, just a cold, clinical emptiness, and I walked out into the night and I disappeared. Because I had learned the art of invisibility, the art of leaving no trace, and I knew that the cartel would not connect Hector's death to me. They would assume it was a rival gang, a settling of scores. And that was exactly what I wanted, because I was not done. I had 3 more names on my list, and I would take them down one by one, slowly, methodically, and I would make each one of them suffer. I would make them feel the fear that my family had felt, the helplessness, the despair, and when I was finished with them, I would go after Ortega himself, and I would tear his empire apart from the inside. And I would leave him alive just long enough to understand that his entire world was crumbling because of me. A girl he had never even known existed, a girl he had tried to burn alive. And that would be the greatest revenge of all, not just his death, but his utter annihilation, his complete and total erasure from the face of the earth. And I knew that I had the skills and the determination to do it, because I had spent 5 years preparing for this. I had sacrificed every piece of my humanity on the altar of vengeance. I had become a monster, a cold-blooded killer, and I was proud of it, because monsters are what the world creates when it fails to protect the innocent. And I was the monster that the Hermanos del Norte had created, the monster that would destroy them all. And I continued my campaign of terror, targeting Javier next, a sadistic brute who had built a reputation for cruelty even among the cartel's ranks. And I tracked him to a brothel in Juarez, where he was indulging his appetites, and I waited for him in the parking lot, and when he stumbled out drunk and satisfied, I struck. I drove a stun gun into his neck and dragged him to a nearby warehouse, and I tied him to a chair, and I took my time. I asked him if he remembered the little boy he had shot in the back, the boy who had been clutching a toy car, and he laughed. He actually laughed and he said, "I've killed so many people. I don't remember any of them. They all look the same when they're dead." And that was the moment I truly understood the depth of the evil I was dealing with, that these men were not human. They were animals, rabid animals that needed to be put down, and so I put him down slowly, painfully, using every technique Salvatore had taught me. And when he was finally dead, his face frozen in a mask of agony, I felt a grim satisfaction, a sense of justice being served. But it was still not enough because there were two more, and then Ortega and I would not rest until they were all gone. And I moved on to Carlos, the one who had set the fire, and I found him living in a gated community in El Paso with a wife and two children pretending to be a normal businessman. But he was not normal. He was a monster wearing a mask, and I did not care about his wife or his children because they were collateral damage, because he had not cared about my family. He had not cared about the screams, the smoke, the agony. And so I waited until his family was out of town, and I broke into his house and I confronted him in his own living room. And he recognized me somehow. He recognized my face, and he said, "You're that girl, the one from the farmhouse. You're supposed to be dead." And I said, "I am dead. I died that night. And I'd come back from hell to take you with me." And I made him suffer, not physically at first, but psychologically. I told him every detail of my family's last moments. I described how my mother had screamed, how my father had tried to protect us, how my siblings had cried for help that never came, and I watched the terror build in his eyes. The realization that there was no escape, that I was going to kill him, that he was going to die alone and afraid, just like my family had died, and when I finally slit his throat, I felt a release. A catharsis that was almost sexual in its intensity, and I knew that I was one step closer to the end, one step closer to Miguel Ortega. And I had learned something important from Carlos's death, that the cartel was starting to notice, that they were connecting the dots, that they were beginning to realize that someone was hunting them, and that made them nervous. Which was exactly what I wanted, because a nervous enemy makes mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities, and I would exploit every single one of them. And so I escalated my campaign. I went after Rodrigo, the one who had watched, the one who had done nothing but stand in the doorway and observe. And I found him in a mansion in Monterrey, surrounded by bodyguards because he had become paranoid. He had become afraid. And I knew that I would have to be more careful, more creative. And so I spent 3 months infiltrating his security team, using my skills and my looks to get close. And one night, I walked into his bedroom, the same way I had walked into that bar 5 years ago, and I looked him in the eye and I said, "Remember me?" And he remembered. He remembered everything, and he begged. He begged for his life. He offered me money. He offered me power. He offered me anything I wanted, and I said, "There is only one thing I want, and that is your death." And I killed him slowly, savoring every moment, every scream, every plea, because he had watched my family die, and he had done nothing, and now he was dying. And I was the one doing the watching. And when it was over, I stood in the middle of that blood-soaked bedroom, and I felt a cold, quiet peace, because the 4 lieutenants were dead and only Ortega remained. And I knew that the final confrontation was coming, that I would have to face the man who had ordered the hit, the man who had destroyed my life, the man who had started it all. And I had been preparing for this moment for years. I knew his habits, his weaknesses, his security protocols, his safe houses, his network, and I knew that I could not kill him in a straightforward way, because he was too powerful, too protected, and I would have to be smarter, more patient, more ruthless than ever before. And so I began the final phase of my plan. A plan that would not only kill Ortega, but destroy everything he had built his empire, his reputation, his legacy, and I would do it by infiltrating his inner circle, by becoming someone he trusted, someone he would never suspect. And I knew that this would require my greatest performance yet, because I would have to become a completely different person, a woman who had no connection to the past, a woman who was loyal to Ortega, a woman who would do anything to gain his confidence. And I had the skills to do it, because I had been trained by the best, and I had the motivation because I had nothing else to live for. And so I began the most dangerous game of my life, a game that would end with either my death or Ortega's. and I was willing to accept either outcome, because I had made peace with the fact that I was already dead, that the girl I had been had died in that crawl space, and what remained was just a vessel for vengeance. A weapon pointed at the heart of the cartel, and I was going to fire that weapon no matter what it cost me. The hardest thing I ever did was not killing those 4 men, not watching the light fade from their eyes, not scrubbing their blood from my hands in the cold hours before dawn. It was becoming someone else entirely. Erasing the girl from the farmhouse. The girl who had once loved sunrises and wildflowers and the sound of her mother's laughter, and replacing her with a hollow, empty vessel that could smile at Miguel Ortega without flinching, that could serve him drinks and laugh at his jokes and pretend to admire his cruelty because that was the only way to get close enough to destroy him. And I spent 6 months crafting my new identity. A woman named Isabella Reyes, a orphan from the streets of Mexico City who had clawed her way up through the ranks of the underworld as a fixer, a cleaner. A woman who could make problems disappear and never asked questions. And I planted the seeds of this identity carefully through a series of carefully orchestrated encounters with Ortega's lower-level operatives, letting them see me, letting them hear whispers of my reputation, letting them come to the conclusion that I was exactly what they needed, a weapon they could use, a tool they could control, and it worked. Because Ortega was paranoid, but he was also arrogant, and he believed that he could see through anyone, that no one could deceive him. And that arrogance was his fatal flaw, because I was not just deceiving him. I was becoming the deception. I was living and breathing the lie until even I forgot who I had been, and when I finally got my chance to meet him. It was at a lavish party at his estate in the hills outside Monterrey, a sprawling compound guarded by armed men and surveillance cameras, and I was introduced as a gifted associate by one of his trusted lieutenants, a man who had vouched for me after I had helped him with a problem. And Ortega looked at me with his cold reptilian eyes and he said, "So you're the one everyone's been talking about. The little ghost who solves problems? Tell me what makes you so special." And I looked him in the eye without flinching, because I had practiced this moment 1,000 times in front of a mirror, and I said, "I am special because I have no attachments, no loyalty to anyone but the person who pays me. And I have no fear because I have already died once, and I know there is nothing on the other side worth fearing." And he laughed a harsh, barking laugh that made my skin crawl, and he said, "I like you. You have balls that's rare in a woman." And I smiled a practiced smile that did not reach my eyes, and I said, "I am not a woman. I am a tool, and tools are only as good as the hands that wield them." And that was the beginning of my infiltration, a slow, agonizing process of building trust, of proving my worth, of becoming indispensable to Ortega's operation. And I started small, running errands, delivering messages, overseeing minor deals. But I did every task with ruthless efficiency, never asking questions, never making mistakes, never showing any weakness. And gradually, Ortega began to rely on me. He began to include me in his inner circle. He began to share his plans with me, his fears, his ambitions, and I listened. I watched, I absorbed every detail, and I built a mental map of his empire, its structure, its vulnerabilities, its hidden weaknesses. And I realized that Ortega's power was built on a foundation of fear and greed, and that foundation was crumbling. Because he had made enemies everywhere, rivals who wanted his territory, former allies who wanted his head, and even his own lieutenants were plotting against him, and I saw an opportunity to accelerate his downfall, not by killing him directly, but by turning his own people against him, by fomenting the paranoia that was already eating away at his soul. And I started planting seeds of doubt, subtle whispers, anonymous tips, insinuations that his most trusted men were betraying him. And I watched as the paranoia took root, as Ortega began to suspect everyone around him, as he ordered executions of loyal soldiers on flimsy pretexts, as his inner circle became a nest of vipers, each one waiting to strike. And I was at the center of it all, the spider in the web, the puppet master pulling the strings, and I felt a cold satisfaction. But it was not enough, because I needed Ortega to suffer more than just the loss of his empire. I needed him to know who had destroyed him. I needed him to see my face in his final moment, to understand that the woman he had trusted had been the instrument of his doom. And so I waited. I bided my time. I continued to play the loyal soldier while the world around Ortega crumbled. And I watched as his empire contracted, as his revenues dried up, as his allies abandoned him, as his enemies closed in from all sides, and he turned to me, the only person he thought he could trust. And he said, "Isabella, I am losing everything. My people are betraying me. My enemies are encircling me, and I don't know who to trust anymore. You are the only one who has never lied to me. The only one who has never failed me. Tell me what to do." And I looked at him, this broken, desperate man who had once been the most feared gangster in the region, and I felt a surge of contempt, so pure that it almost made me laugh, because he was so blind, so utterly, completely blind. And I said, "Miguel, there is only one thing to do. You need to eliminate everyone who could be a threat, everyone who has ever doubted you, and you need to do it now before they strike first." And I handed him a list of names I had carefully curated, names of his loyal lieutenants, his most devoted soldiers, his own cousins and nephews. And he looked at the list and he said, "These are my people, my family. Are you sure?" And I said, "I am sure. I have evidence. I have proof they are all conspiring against you, and if you do not act, they will kill you." And he believed me, because he had no one else to believe, and he ordered the mass execution of his own inner circle, a bloody purge that decimated the leadership of the Hermanos del Norte, and the cartel was thrown into chaos. And its enemies, the rival gangs, the federales, the vigilantes, all smelled blood and moved in for the kill, and Ortega's empire collapsed in a matter of weeks. His drug routes seized his safe houses, raided his finances frozen, and he was left with nothing but a handful of loyalists and a mounting stack of enemies. And he turned to me, his eyes wild with desperation, and he said, "Isabella, we need to run. We need to disappear. We need to start over." And I said, "Yes, Miguel, we need to go. I know a place, a safe house in the mountains. No one will find us there." And he agreed, because he had no other options. And I led him into the wilderness, into the Sierra Madre, into the heart of the territory where I had grown up, where my family had been murdered, where the bones of my loved ones were buried in unmarked graves, and we drove for hours through winding mountain roads. And I watched the landscape change from the gaudy opulence of his estate to the stark beauty of the desert, and I felt a calm settle over me, because I knew that this was the end. This was the final act, and when we reached the abandoned farmhouse, the one I had chosen deliberately because it was a replica of the one I had grown up, in the one that had been burned to the ground, I stopped the car and I said, "We're here, Miguel. This is where it ends." And he looked at me confused and he said, "What do you mean this is just an old ruin? There's nothing here." And I turned to him and I let the mask fall away. I let him see the hatred that had been burning in my soul for a decade. And I said, "Look at this place, Miguel. Look at it carefully. Does it remind you of anything?" And he squinted, and I saw the realization dawn on his face, the recognition, the dawning horror. And he stammered, This is the farmhouse, the one from West Texas, the one we burned. But that was destroyed. That was years ago. How did you?" And I laughed a cold, bitter laugh that echoed through the ruins, and I said, "I rebuilt it, Miguel. I rebuilt it brick by brick just for this moment, just so you could see it before you die. Because this is where my family died. This is where you destroyed my life, and now this is where you will die, and you will die alone, and no one will ever know what happened to you, because you will simply disappear the same way I disappeared, the same way my family disappeared, and the world will move on, and you will be forgotten, and I will be free." And he lunged at me, a desperate, futile attack. But I had been trained for this. I had been waiting for this, and I sidestepped him, and I drove my fist into his throat, and he crumpled to the ground, gasping, and I stood over him, looking down at the man who had taken everything from me, and I felt a surge of emotions, rage, grief, triumph, but also something else, something unexpected, pity, because he was just a man, a broken, pathetic man who had built his life on cruelty and fear, and in the end, he was nothing less than nothing. And I knelt beside him and I whispered, "Miguel, Do you know who I am? I am the girl you thought you killed. The girl who watched her family burn, the girl who crawled out of the ashes and swore she would destroy you, and I have kept that promise. I have destroyed everything you ever built, and now I am going to destroy you, but not quickly, not mercifully, because you do not deserve mercy. And I took out my knife. The same knife I had used to kill Hector, and I began to cut slowly, methodically, making sure he felt every ounce of pain that my family had felt. And he screamed, he begged, he wept, but I felt nothing. Nothing but the cold satisfaction of a debt finally paid, and when I was done, when he was nothing but a bloody broken corpse, I stood up and I looked at the farmhouse, the replica I had built, and I set it on fire, the same fire that had consumed my home. And I watched it burn, and I watched Ortega's body burn with it, and I felt a release, a catharsis, a weight lifting from my shoulders that I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to be free. And I walked away from the flames into the darkness of the desert. And I knew that my revenge was complete, that I had done what I set out to do, that the men who had killed my family were all dead, and their empire was in ruins. And I had nothing left to fight for, nothing left to live for, and I felt the emptiness return, the void that had been filled by my hatred. But now the hatred was gone, and the void was vast and cold and infinite. And I did not know what to do with myself because I had spent so many years defined by my revenge that I had forgotten how to be a person, how to feel joy, how to love, how to hope. And I wandered through the desert for days, my body moving on autopilot, my mind numb, and I ended up in a small village on the coast, a place where no one knew me, a place where I could start over. But I did not know how to start over because starting over requires a belief in the future, and I had none. And I lived in that village for a year working odd jobs, keeping to myself. And I thought about my family every day. I thought about my mother's smile, my father's strength, my siblings' laughter. And I realized that they had not died in vain because their deaths had given me the strength to become something, not something good, but something powerful, something that could change the world. And I decided that I would not waste that power. I would not let my family's sacrifice be meaningless, and so I began to use my skills for something other than revenge. I started to help others, to protect the innocent, to hunt down the predators who preyed on the weak. And I became a vigilante, a ghost in the shadows, a legend whispered in the underworld, and I found a new purpose, not in destroying, but in protecting, not in killing, but in saving. And I built a network of informants, of allies, of fellow survivors, and we fought back against the cartels, the traffickers, the corrupt officials, and we made a difference, a real difference. And I felt a warmth that I had not felt since before my family died, a warmth that came from knowing that I was making the world a little bit better, a little bit safer, a little bit more just, and I knew that my family would be proud of me, not because I had avenged them, but because I had turned my pain into purpose, and that was the truest revenge of all. Not the destruction of my enemies, but the creation of a legacy that honored my loved ones, and I carried that legacy with me for the rest of my life, a beacon in the darkness, a reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal, even the darkest nights can give way to dawn, and I had finally found my dawn, not in the flames of revenge, but in the light of redemption. And I was at peace, truly at peace for the first time in my entire existence. And so, I stood at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, watching the waves crash against the cliffs of the Baja Peninsula, the salt spray misting my face, the wind whipping my hair into a tangled mess. And I felt the weight of a decade of violence and vengeance slowly, inexorably begin to lift from my shoulders because Miguel Ortega was dead. His empire was ashes, his lieutenants were rotting in unmarked graves, and the men who had murdered my family had been erased from the face of the earth. And yet I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of closure, only a vast, aching emptiness that seemed to stretch to the horizon and beyond, because I had spent so many years defining myself by my hatred that I had forgotten who I was without it. And now that the hatred was gone, I was left with nothing but a hollow shell, a weapon without a target, a ghost without a purpose. And I realized that revenge had not healed me. It had not brought my family back. It had not given me peace. It had only given me a temporary reprieve from the grief, a fleeting moment of power that had faded as quickly as it had come, and I was still alone, still broken. Still adrift in a world that had no place for me, and I thought about what my mother would have said if she had seen me now, if she had seen the woman I had become. A cold-blooded killer with blood on her hands and a void in her heart. And I knew that she would have wept, not for the enemies I had killed, but for the daughter I had lost. The daughter who had once loved life, who had laughed freely, who had dreamed of becoming a teacher or a nurse, who had believed in the goodness of people, and I had killed that daughter. I had murdered her with my own hands, the same hands that had slit throats and pulled triggers, and I could not bring her back no matter how many enemies I destroyed, no matter how much blood I spilled. And that realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, and I fell to my knees on the rocky shore, and I wept, not tears of rage or sorrow, but tears of grief for the person. I had been the person I could have been, the person I would never be again, and I wept for my family, for the life we had shared, for the future we had been denied, and I wept for myself, for the years I had wasted on hatred, for the humanity I had sacrificed on the altar of revenge, and when the tears finally stopped, I felt a strange calm, a quiet acceptance, because I realized that I could not change the past. I could not undo what I had done. I could only move forward. And moving forward meant finding a way to live with the person I had become, to make peace with the monster I had created, to find some semblance of meaning in a life that had been defined by destruction. And I decided in that moment that I would not let my family's deaths be in vain. I would not let my own descent into darkness be meaningless. I would find a way to turn my pain into something positive, something that could help others, something that could honor the memory of the people I had loved. And I started by returning to the United States, to the dusty plains of West Texas, to the land where I had been born, and I visited the site of the old farmhouse, the original one, the one that had been burned to the ground, and I found that the land had been reclaimed by nature, wildflowers growing where the ashes had once been, and I knelt down and I touched the soil, and I felt a connection, a tether to my past, to my family, to the roots that had been torn from me. And I made a vow, not a vow of vengeance, but a vow of renewal, a promise to rebuild my life, to become someone worthy of my family's memory, to find a purpose that did not involve killing or destroying. And I started by going back to school, because my mother had always wanted me to get an education. She had worked extra shifts at the diner to save for my college fund, the same fund that had been stolen by the cartel, and I enrolled in a community college in a small town using a fake identity I had created years ago. And I studied psychology because I wanted to understand the human mind, to understand why people like Ortega became what they did, to understand why I had become what I had. And I threw myself into my studies with the same intensity I had once reserved for my revenge, because I needed to fill the void. I needed to give my mind something to focus on that was not death and destruction, and I found that I had a talent for it, a gift for understanding people, for seeing through their masks, for recognizing the trauma that lurked beneath the surface. And I graduated at the top of my class, and I went on to earn a master's degree and then a PhD, and I became a licensed therapist, specializing in trauma and post-traumatic stress, because I knew better than anyone what it was like to live with the ghosts of the past, to be haunted by memories that would not fade, to feel like you were drowning in a sea of pain and there was no lifeline in sight. And I opened a small practice in a modest office in El Paso, a city that straddled the border between two worlds, a city that was filled with people who had suffered, people who had lost everything, people who were searching for a way to heal. And I dedicated myself to helping them, because in helping them, I was helping myself. I was slowly, painfully teaching myself to forgive not the men who had killed my family, because I would never forgive them but myself for the years I had wasted, the lives I had taken, the person I had become. And I learned that forgiveness is not a single act. It is a process, a long, arduous journey that requires patience and grace and a willingness to let go of the past. And I was not always successful. There were days when the rage returned, when the memories overwhelmed me, when I wanted to burn the world down. But I had learned to recognize those moments, to breathe through them. to remind myself that I was no longer that person, that I had chosen a different path, a harder path, a path that required me to be gentle with myself, to be compassionate, to be human. And I found that the more I helped others, the more I healed myself, because every patient I treated, every survivor I guided, was a mirror reflecting my own journey, my own pain, my own hope. And I watched them transform. I watched them reclaim their lives, and I felt a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before, a purpose that was not about destruction, but about creation, not about hate, but about love, not about the past, but about the future. And I knew that I had finally found my calling, that I had finally become the person my mother had always believed I could be, and I thought about her every day. I talked to her in my prayers. I asked her for guidance, and I felt her presence in the quiet moments, in the laughter of my patients, in the warmth of the sun on my face. And I knew that she was proud of me, that she had never stopped believing in me, even when I had stopped believing in myself. And I felt a peace that I had not felt since before the night my family died, a peace that was not dependent on external circumstances, a peace that came from within, a peace that was the foundation of a new life, a life that was rich and full and meaningful. And I continued my work for decades, becoming a renowned expert in trauma therapy, writing books, giving lectures, training other therapists. And I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot the darkness that had consumed me, because it was that darkness that gave me the empathy to help others, that gave me the strength to fight for justice. That gave me the wisdom to know that the only way out of the abyss is to climb hand over hand toward the light. And I climbed every single day, and I helped others climb. And I built a community of survivors, a family of choice that filled the void left by the family I had lost, and I loved them fiercely and unconditionally, and they loved me back. And that love was the greatest revenge of all, not against my enemies who were dead and gone, but against the world that had tried to break me, against the fate that had tried to destroy me, against the darkness that had tried to consume me because I had survived. I had thrived, and I had become something beautiful, something powerful, something unstoppable, and I knew that my story was not just a story of revenge. It was a story of redemption, a story of hope, a story of a woman who had been broken and had rebuilt herself piece by piece into something stronger and more resilient than she had ever been. And I wrote a memoir not to glorify my past, but to offer a roadmap to others, a guide to the treacherous terrain of trauma and recovery, and I called it The Ashes We Carry. Because I knew that every survivor carries ashes, remnants of the fire that destroyed them, and those ashes can either weigh you down or they can fertilize the soil for new growth. And I had chosen to let my ashes nourish the garden of my new life, a garden filled with flowers of compassion and trees of resilience and fruits of joy. And I dedicated the book to my family, to the mother who had taught me to love, to the father who had taught me to fight, to the siblings who had taught me to laugh. And I wrote, to my family, who I carry in my heart every day, you are not gone. You are not forgotten. You are the reason I rise. And the book became a bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, read by millions of people around the world. And I received letters from survivors in every corner of the globe, women who had been abused, men who had been traumatized, children who had lost everything. And each letter was a reminder that my pain had a purpose, that my journey was not just about me, that I had been given the gift of resilience so that I could share it with others. And I answered every letter I wrote back to every single person, because I knew that a single word of encouragement could change a life, could give someone the strength to keep going, could be the lifeline that they needed. And I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the suffering I had endured, but for the opportunity to transform that suffering into something meaningful, something that could heal the world. And as I grew older, as my hair turned silver and my face lined with the map of a life fully lived, I looked back at the girl who had crawled out of that farmhouse bleeding and broken, and I felt a surge of love and pride for her, because she had been so brave, so determined, so unwilling to give up, and she had paved the way for the woman I had become. A woman who had not only survived, but thrived, who had not only avenged, but healed, who had not only destroyed, but created. And I knew that my legacy was not the blood I had spilled, but the lives I had saved, the hope I had inspired, the love I had shared. And that was the true meaning of revenge, not to destroy your enemies, but to become so powerful, so fulfilled, so complete, that your enemies become irrelevant, that they fade into the background of your life like distant noise, that you no longer even remember the details of their faces because they have been replaced by the faces of the people you love. And I had reached that point. I had finally reached that point, and it was glorious. And I spent my final years surrounded by the family I had built, the friends I had made, the patients I had helped, and I felt a contentment that was deeper than any satisfaction revenge had ever given me. Because this was not fleeting, this was not dependent on external circumstances. This was a state of being, a way of living, a gift that I had given myself through years of hard work and healing. And when the end came, when I lay on my deathbed surrounded by the people who loved me, I did not fear it. I welcomed it because I knew that I was going to see my family again, my mother, my father, my siblings, and they were waiting for me. And I smiled a genuine, radiant smile, and I whispered, "I'm coming home." And I closed my eyes, and I felt the warmth of their embrace, the love that had never died, and I let go of this world and stepped into the next. And I was free, finally and completely free, and I knew that my story had come full circle. From the ashes of destruction to the light of redemption, from the darkness of hate to the warmth of love, from the loneliness of revenge to the community of healing. And I had done it all, and I had no regrets, not a single one, because every step of my journey had been necessary. Every moment of pain had been a teacher. Every act of vengeance had been a stepping stone to a higher purpose. And I had reached that purpose. I had achieved that goal. I had become the person I was always meant to be, and that was the greatest victory of all. And as I drifted into the eternal peace, I heard my mother's voice, soft and sweet, and she said, "Welcome home, my daughter. Welcome home." And I knew that I was finally, truly, completely at peace, and that was the end, the true end. The only end that mattered. The end where love conquered all, where hope triumphed over despair, where the light vanquished the darkness. And I was that light, and I would shine forever, a beacon in the night, a guide for all those who were lost, a testament to the power of the human spirit. And I was grateful, so deeply, profoundly grateful for every moment of my life, every tear, every laugh, every triumph, every failure, because they had all led me to this moment of perfect, absolute peace. And I embraced it. I embraced it with all my heart, and I let go, and I was free, and that was the final revenge. The revenge that mattered most, the revenge that I had earned through a lifetime of struggle and sacrifice, the revenge of a life well lived, a life that had purpose, a life that had meaning, a life that had love. And I was that life, and I was that love, and I was that light, and I would never, ever stop shining.